Good morning. I am Kevin Price. Delighted to be with you. Going to spend some time talking to you about you and your business. Going to jump straight in with a conversation with Mark Schill. And he's the lead author of the U.S. National Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Enterprising States Innovate study. And delighted to have him on the program because he's got some interesting things to say about the state of Texas, which I'm delighted to talk about. But also want to learn more about, how Texas compares with the rest of the country and what else is going on out there. Mark, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
You bet. Tell us a little bit about the project and what motivated the foundation to pursue it.
Sure. We started it, this is the sixth report we've done annually, and we started it back when the recession was really in full bore. The job stress on the economy was pretty acute, and a lot of the states were going through some pretty significant budget turbulence and problems, and revenues were way down, and they're having to make a lot of tough decisions. And so we started under those circumstances, really focusing on jobs, how states are creating jobs, what states needed to do to create more jobs. And it's evolved over time. Up until this year, we really focused on this issue of innovation and technology and stimulating entrepreneurship and what the states are doing across their different policies, different programs. And so what we do is we look at rating the states across their performance, but we also try to highlight some of the best practices in public policy across the country.
Awesome. Very good. Talk a little bit about this study. Was there, first of all, kind of give us a panoramic overview. Who are the winners? Who are the losers?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We look at six broad categories, everything from economic performance to transportation to this innovation and business climate and the talent pipeline, and then this technology index we created just for this year. And what we found pretty interesting overall was that a lot of the states you wouldn't expect to be growing in tech were some of the ones growing the fastest. And, of course, some of those are farther behind than others, so they're just catching up. But California came in only sixth in our high-tech rankings, behind a state like Utah, which was second.
Yeah.
So that was pretty interesting. Texas did fairly well in our tech ranking, came in eighth overall. And I think what was pretty interesting to me about Texas was certainly the growth numbers were strong. We look at two key things, along with broadband. We look at the tech industry growth, so the jobs within companies that are in the high-tech sectors, but also STEM jobs. So those are more of a workforce measure across the entire economy. So we're looking at, say, an engineer that may be working in any type of business, whether it be manufacturing or a services company or software. And so Texas grew both in STEM jobs, second in the country in the last 10 years in STEM job growth, and sixth in high-tech industry growth. But what was interesting is it's in the top 20 in concentration of those two things as well. So in other words, the state is 14th in tech concentration and 16th in STEM concentration. So there's already a decent critical mass there in Texas, saying that, sometimes we hear this narrative, well, in Texas it's just these low-paying jobs that's growing, and that's all that's happening. But our tech growth index here shows that that's not totally the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math, for those who might not be familiar with that. And talk a little bit about, well, I know I'm curious, I'm sure the listeners curious too, well, who ended up being number one in technology?
It was Washington, actually. And Washington is pretty interesting, of course, because it has that presence of Microsoft. But it also has some high-tech. We look at our measure of high-tech also includes some manufacturing. So some of the aerospace activity, of course, Boeing has a long history in Washington. And that breeds over time, I think, a pretty strong concentration of engineers and high-tech people in the workforce. And that's another interesting finding we noticed, too, especially when looking at the science, technology, engineering, and math cluster of workers, is that even as the industry shifts and cycles, you see that acumen inherent in the DNA of different states. For instance, Michigan still has a pretty high concentration of engineers. And so for a state like that, they can still build on that, even though what's happened in the last 2 or 3 decades in the the auto manufacturing economy may not be great for Michigan as it's shifted. They still have a lot of this competitive advantage in their workforce of people who know how to build things.
Yeah, but at the same time, the state's going through a metamorphosis of unbelievable proportions. You're talking about a state that was ranked 48th, 49th in competitiveness in 2008 is now ranked around 25 in competitiveness and is rising quickly. A state that had, closed union shops that made it so exhausting for anything entrepreneurial to get started of significance to now being a right-to-work state. So that state's changing dramatically.
Yeah, it is, and that's what's very interesting is even when you look at just manufacturing growth, they were hit very hard, of course, but now they're one of the top, if not the top state in the short term in manufacturing growth, so they're bouncing back, and I think that was another theme we found in looking across the country in general at innovation, is that certainly it creates a lot of opportunity, it creates new industries, and it creates new jobs and new companies, but there's another side of that coin in that it creates turbulence in a lot of existing industries. And so we're seeing this transition in manufacturing is a great example, where there's this turnover and it's forcing this change and reconstitution of a lot of these industries, and it's forcing state and regional leaders to look at skills training and look at education and say, look, we need to make sure that our education systems are serving our students well, but they're also serving the economy well, and we need to reskill and help these folks that are caught in this change in what these jobs require to make sure we have opportunities to help retrain them.
Yeah, and by the way, not to become overly partisan, because my listeners know how much I have great disdain for both major parties. I really can't stand either one. But what's interesting in Michigan is that they had dominance for generations of Democrats in both houses of their legislature, a Democrat governor for as far back as people can remember. They dumped all of it and replaced it with Republicans for both houses and a governor, and I think that's probably obviously been a big part of that. Talk a little bit about public policy having an impact on these states.
Yeah, it's very interesting, I think, even from a partisan perspective, is to look at how structural shifts in things can turn the cup over and dump it out. But I also would point out that the other interesting point about looking at job creation and the economy is that when you really get to the core of it, everyone has a common interest in growing their state, in increasing incomes, in prosperity, in just general positive quality of life in their state. And so what we try to do is anchor everyone on that and say, look, we can argue about how to do these things, but let's at least agree that we're on the same team here, which of course is sometimes wishful thinking. But yeah. I think the big change that we're seeing on the policy side is that this convergence between the business and the government and the individual worker, and that's driven by, one is this skills training shift, but also this broader change in outlook and how do we orient our economic development systems in states. It used to be we'd spend a lot of money on recruiting and high dollar incentives and that sort of thing, and those things aren't going to go away. But I think most states, especially the smaller ones, are recognizing we can take some of that money and instead of making big bets, is spread that out across our local entrepreneurs, or not even making costly investments. Let's look at capacity. Let's look at our entrepreneurial capacity. Let's look at our business climate and make sure that we have the systems in place that our local, regional entrepreneurs can be successful. And some of the research backs that up, is that it's these gazelle firms, these young companies that are 10 to 100 employees that are fast growing. Those are the ones that create the jobs at the fastest rate. And so a lot of states are looking at things like economic gardening initiatives to say, what can we do to focus on these companies and make sure that they've got what they need? Or other things like, let's look at our capital structure. Are we missing key parts of that system in our state? And is there ways that we can either tweak our regulatory system or perhaps help build better networks around angel capital, around venture capital, even around lenders? And so
got to wrap it up with that, Mark Schill. Thank you so much for your time. U.S. National Chamber of Commerce Foundation, Enterprising States Innovate Study. By the way, you want to find out more about it, just go to uschamberfoundation.org/enterprising states. And thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate your interest in the work.
It's great stuff. We'll probably get you back on. We want to have you elaborate more. When we come back, much more for you. Do want to remind you, best content here shows up over there at usdailyreview.com. And you're listening to The Price of Business.